In 2023, Windstone Wallboards will open its new jib plasterboard manufacturing and distribution facility in Tauriko, Tauranga. Built on 12.8 hectares of land, it will be 2.5 times bigger than the current site. Designed with sustainability at the forefront, the new plant will have extensive recycling capability on site for water and waste. It will also include new state-of-the-art technology and equipment, enabling the business to manufacture the full range of our jib plasterboard products with a high degree of flexibility. The new Windstone Wallboards facility reinforces our commitment to manufacturing in New Zealand, and we look forward to sharing this journey with you. In 20
No mai haere mai. This is the second conversation in the University of Auckland School of Architecture and Planning Spring Fast Forward 2021 series. And many thanks to JIB for their sponsorship. COVID-19, and now unfortunately COVID-2021 comes with very few advantages beyond technology and the need to be in an icy lecture theatre. The capacity to connect with outstanding alumni transcending geography is the nucleus of the series, which has been organised by Julia Gatley and myself on behalf of the school's History and Theory Research Hub. Now, if you have any questions, please can you put them into the Q&A function on your Zoom? And move on, last week's series opened with Professor Mark Wigley. Tonight, we have Dr. Elizabeth Farrelly. Elizabeth is an architect, philosopher, urbanist, critic, writer, and commentator with an impressive cross-genre pedigree. She has embraced local politics, university teaching, crime fiction, and farming. A very warm welcome, Elizabeth, Superwoman, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Elizabeth. One Elizabeth to another.
One to another. Well, Australia and New Zealand surrounded by moats, but COVID has infiltrated Sydney. How's life for you in its lockdown present?
Life in lockdown. Well, look, one of the things I've just done in lockdown is move house. So it, which has been, you know, nightmarish as usual, but probably no worse, and in some ways easier than moving house normally because there's sort of no traffic and so on. And weirdly for me, I've moved from the inner city where I've lived as long as I can remember to something much more like a suburb. So that's curious. But in COVID, it feels quite good. Sorry?
I thought you hated them.
Well, I thought so too. And there are reasons for this. And it's not as suburb as it might be. So it's still quite tight, like as Sydney tends to be, you know, in its kind of inner suburbs. But for me, it feels like being almost in the country because there's trees and grass and front yards and backyards and things, which I never expected to have again. But I've done this curious thing anyway. So interesting.
And probably very wisely, since you can't go anywhere. You could at least look at the back.
Yeah, and you can't, you know, in Sydney, you can't afford anything. There's nothing in the inner city just about, except a shoebox for less than about $3 or $4 million. And you know, one of those things.
Auckland's rapidly following.
Yes.
Anyway, I think you were born in Dunedin.
I was.
I think you contemplated a career in medicine. So what diverted you into architecture?
Oh, well, yes, it's ancient history, of course, now. But I enrolled in medicine. I applied for both schools of medicine, but I had family. I had my father teaching at the Auckland School and a sister who was a student there. And so I decided to go to Dunedin because I always liked to do things a difficult way, I suppose. And I thought it would be fun to get out of home. But one of the curious things about Dunedin Medical School then, possibly still, I don't know, is that it had an intermediate year, which meant, and because I'd got, you know, a scholarship or something, I was exempted all of the normal science subjects for my medical intermediate, so I could do whatever I liked. And I chose philosophy and ancient Greek art, I think, and English literature and maths, as you do. And that sort of tipped me sideways from thinking that a future in the sciences was going to be fun to thinking that something a little bit more humanities organized would be interesting. And then I ended up doing the second year of those studies in Auckland and sharing a house, a funny little old timber cottage in Parnell with one in particular architecture student, Jeff Fletcher, who was great, and some other of his friends who used to hang around and they used to draw all night and, you know, sit up drinking coffee and having a lot of what looked like fun. And I thought, oh, maybe I should do architecture. It was as silly as that, really.
Well, Mark Wigley last week described his time as a student at the University of Auckland as a loose. What are your reflections of your era?
Oh, look, I think back on that time as an extraordinary privilege. I mean, it probably isn't going to happen again the way it happened then because, you know, university was free for us. In fact, you know, we got paid bursaries and things to go to university, and that pretty much covered the rent. So you had to work a little bit in the holidays, but not very much really. And we all lived in the inner city. I lived in Parnell and in what's it called, Herne Bay and Ponsonby. You know, and so I walked to university every day, and you could do that for just about nothing. You could live for almost no rent. In Grafton, when Grafton was still Grafton, and what that meant was that there was this, you know, every night, or certainly every night from Friday through the weekends, there were funny little parties in those tiny sort of timber cottages that used to sort of sprinkle themselves through Grafton Gully, which was basically covered in bush with funny little streets. And so it'd be kind of go to the Kiwi or whatever the other pubs were called, and then where are the parties? And everyone would pile into cars, half of them much too drunk to drive, of course, and go off to these parties. And life was really easy and sort of idyllic, I suppose. It sounds terribly hippie now, I was in, I don't even know if the architecture school's still organized like this. I'm sure it's not, but we moved into what we call the new building in my second year, I think, or first year. No, it must have been, anyway, sometime during the course. But for the first year or two, I was in timber, so-called timber, and we had that lovely railway hostel down next to Elam in the gully as our sort of that two-story veranda job where you could remake rooms and you could sleep over and just sort of work all night or do other things all night. And it was so loose, is right. But also to me, it felt incredibly, after all of that, you know, sciences and literature and stuff and sort of brain work, it felt unbelievably creative. I was just blown away by architecture and by the sense that you could live that way, but also that combined with that was the discovery that space could mean something. And I just thought that was astonishing. It had never crossed my mind before. And I remember that feeling in first year when you think, whoa, this is amazing. So yeah, it was cool. We were very lucky.
Yeah, it was a wild time. And I'm sitting in the building that we moved into, or you moved into tonight.
I recognize the concrete.
Really interested, particularly now that you've given us a wee bit of background in terms of your journey into architecture with your 1981 thesis, which was Inside Out, the House as a Mask. I found it didactic and deliciously peppered, if I might say, with poetry, suggesting that you were already veering away from a tectonic future. And I also found in it, I think, the seeds of much of your later work as well, the morality of architecture, the yearning for beauty, for truth. And I loved it. You concluded with Noel Coward's cocktails and laughter. What comes next? Nobody knows. So what did come next, apart from more cocktails and laughter in the decade after graduation?
That was a very romantic exercise, wasn't it? I actually was completely intoxicated writing that thing. It sounds like it, I think now. Whoa, she was drunk. I mean, I wasn't drunk. I was drunk on all the ideas, but so much fun. So after that, I went to work for what was still called JazzMad. That was fun, actually. I sort of got I suppose you'd call it headhunted, but invited to apply or to take a job there as a young graduate. And that was a lot of fun. And we worked on the museum, I've forgotten what it's called now, in Hamilton. And the director, Ken Gorby, I just discovered recently, to my astonishment, not only became the director of Te Papa, but also then later of one of my most beloved museums, which was the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, and was instrumental in making that into the most fantastic thing. Nevertheless, so we worked with him. That was a lot of fun because he was a great client. He had a lot of humor and imagination. And but I suppose really, but I found architecture. I already found architecture, as you suggest, a kind of frustrating. I loved the ideas in architecture and still do up to a point, insofar as there are ideas. But I suppose I was seeking a clearer manifestation of ideas than you can actually probably get into built form. And also I'm impatient. And so I probably found writing, when I came around to it, more sort of instant gratification-y. And that's really what happened next. So after a couple of years at JazzMad, I left relatively late, as the expectation ran. Most people sort of left quite younger than I was. I think I was 26 or something by the time I went to the UK and sort of lobbed into London. And typical me, knowing nothing, knowing nobody, with no money, no connections, no sense of what I was going to do. And stayed with a friend, Mandy Reynolds, who's still in London, in Camden Town. And again, so lucky. She had I think we had the top half of a funny little terrace house in Camden Town, which Ken Livingstone had rented out for £4 a week or something as short life housing because it was going to be demolished, which I don't know if it ever was. Perhaps it was. And so I lived in the attic there for a few months while I found a job. I took a job in Bristol first, and after about a month realized that Bristol was going to bore me to death, even though it's very pretty. I looked at the map, thought, Bristol's by the sea, isn't it? Oh, let's go there. And of course it's not by the sea, it's by the river, and it's very sort of sweet, but stayed. Anyway, and they wanted me to be sort of the design architect, this firm I worked for, and that was all a bit, it was huge responsibility, and I think I probably chickened out slightly. Anyway, I ran away, took another job in London and worked on the docklands on the Royal Victoria Dock, which was then, this is Thatcher was in charge, but before the docklands was converted, and I was working with a firm called Pollard, Thomas and Edwards, and Richard Rogers' firm was doing the master plan of the docks. And this is also typical me, I kept arguing with the bosses, as one does, and telling them that we should be talking to Richard Rogers because they were doing the master plan, and what would happen if, for example, they did a light rail, which they eventually did, and shouldn't we be across that? And they said, no, of course not. We'll do our own work. So I thought that was silly. I've always been rather oversupplied with arrogance, I think, thinking that I was right about things. Anyway, so and as luck would have it, I was having Alan Wilde, who was then the professor of architecture, was over in London for one of those Commonwealth boards that he was on, and it was summer, and the summer shows were on, including the end of year show at the AA, so it was June, I guess. And I'd been to see this show, which had work by people like Zaha Hadid and Nigel Coates and Ron Arad, and I was incensed that I thought it was fatuous, most of it. And he said, we were having a glass of wine somewhere, and I was having a rave about what rubbish this work was. And he said, well, don't tell me, write it down and send it to someone. And I'd really only written one thing before for publication, and that was in New Zealand for New Zealand Architect. I think that's what it's called. And so there was that one piece, and that was it that I thought, well, okay, I'll do that. So I wrote down what I thought and got the office typist, back in the day when people still had typists, to type it up for me. And I thought, whoa, this is fantastic. I love doing this. And I sent it to a magazine, a weekly called Building Design in London. And they put it not on the front page, but sort of on the inside of the front page, I think, or something like that. So suddenly I was sort of notorious in London, because you don't say things like that about the AA. And I didn't know that. I just thought, well, that's what I think. So I was just kind of, blundering in. And really on the basis of that, I was more or less offered a job at the Architectural Review as an assistant editor. I mean, it sounds blindingly improbable and lucky now, and it probably was. But Peter Davey was the editor of the AR, and he said, we've got a job going here, do you? And I'm going, no, I didn't. And I nearly said no, because I thought, don't be stupid. Why would I want to write about it? I want to be an architect. And then actually Winston Barnett, who later became my husband, said, don't be ridiculous. You do not say no to an office like that. At least talk to him, so I did, and thought, oh, maybe that'll be fun. And it was. So yeah, that's kind of how I switched horses, and had an absolute ball lobbing into what was then in the middle of Westminster in London, as a kind of complete ingenue,
Well, and the wonderful serendipity of youth.
Yes, just lucky, really.
So why did you leave?
Why did I leave New Zealand?
No, why did you leave the Architectural Review?
Well, I probably shouldn't have, to be honest. Again, that was probably to do with my arrogance. So I was there for about 4 years or something, and I had a lot of fun, and I got a lot of, I was sent to, Genoa and Houston to talk to Renzo Piano because we did a special issue or something on Renzo, and I got to do most of it and to follow him around the place and stuff like that. So that was really fun. Again, I used to argue with everyone because, they did things that I thought was disgraceful, like selling advertising, too much advertising, and publishing things that none of us thought were terribly good. And in other words, not being principled enough for me. I've always been a bit puritanical about principles, and that always gets me to trouble. And I should really just keep my mouth shut. But I say what really impelled me to leave in the end was Winston and I both. We were offered by various means. We came to Sydney and we met Neville Quarry, who was then head of RMIT, Newswhich Schools of Architecture. And we also went to Auckland, and we each did a 3-month visiting lectureship at the Auckland School, which was a lot of fun. And I think it was the offer of that. And I said to my boss, Peter Davey in London, I want to go and do this thing. And he said, I can't give you that time off. I can't lose you for 3 months. And I sort of said, well, I'm going to go anyway. Whereas I should have said, oh, okay, let's sign a compromise, but that wasn't me. So I just sort of, and I said, well, you'll have to sack me then. And I think he did, or something like that. So I ended up, throwing it away for the chance to do the academic thing, which was a lot of fun, but I probably should have stayed in London, certainly. Whether I should have stayed at the AR, I don't know, because I never really wanted primarily to write for a professional audience. I really love writing for the public, which has got to be the least sort of successful and remunerative way of writing about architecture, but I love it. Yeah. And that's where in London, I fell in love because there are so many fabulous newspapers. I used to read the not just what everyone called the Grawny ad, because it was full of typos, but, the Times and the Spectator and the Independent and all sorts of, right across the political spectrum. And I just loved that rude literary tradition and the tradition of criticism that you get in London, where everyone would say, "Oh, this is the worst building he's done for years," and he never was any good anyway. And instead of suing, they would just argue it out. Everyone would sort of pile on. It was just such a lot of fun, and it was also the use of language was elegant, and the use of ideas was also sort of sharp and focused, and I loved that about the public artistic and cultural debate in London. It's great.
Do you think London's still like that?
I don't know, probably not as much. I mean, I suspect that the sort of dumbing down that's happened here has happened everywhere in Western culture to some extent, but probably it's still got that strand, I suspect, a bit, if you want to be part of it. And that's one of the things that I loved about the UK, actually, was that there were, excuse me, that there were lots of different, it was so complex as a culture and as a society, and that meant that there were lots of different parts of it you could be within. It wasn't just a single hierarchy. It wasn't just like in Sydney, it's mostly about money, but you could be sort of impoverished gentry or real gentry, and you could take that stuff seriously or not. You could be an eccentric and part of that kind of artistic world, and they were sort of more or less separate, and I felt as though they all had their own dignity in some way. So that was really fun.
And wonderful eccentricity.
Yes. Yeah, you can be as nutty as you like. I mean, Boris, for example. And everyone thinks, oh, that's just him, her, So that was lovely. And I often think, in some ways, even though you can't really do that properly, probably as a foreigner, I often think that's maybe more me. I don't know. Anyway, you have these regrets. Sometimes I think I should have stayed in Europe, because Europe also feels very much a sort of home to me culturally.
I share your views. Anyway, you returned to Sydney, and then in the mid-90s, you served as a City of Sydney alderperson and councillor. Yep. So what tempted you into politics? that was art of looking for trouble.
Yeah, I arrived in Sydney, and pretty much, not quite immediately, but very soon after, that was the end of '88. And we got married and I got pregnant. And so I was suddenly thinking, oh, whoops, having a baby, as you do. Life is full of accidents somehow. And it wasn't really an accident, but anyway. And so I had a call from the books editor from the Architectural Press in London saying, can you do a book? A book is a really good thing to do while you're having a baby. And I'm thinking, really? Not that he would have known, of course. And it was a bit silly, but at the same time, and then I thought, oh, I'm still a bit bored, so why don't I do a doctorate? And at the same time as all of those things, I was writing already for the Herald. Someone said, Graham Yarn, actually, and Michael Dickinson. And Graham Yarn's now the city planner, but back then he was a young architect. And he and Michael Dickinson, who later died, sadly, took me out for coffee and said, you know, if you're going to be here in Sydney, you should write for the Sydney Morning Herald, ring them up and tell them that they need you to write about architecture. So I did. And this lovely arts editor, Peter Cochrane, said, okay, well, send me something. And so I sent him something. And I started to do that fortnightly. So I was doing all of those things. And then, and of course, so writing about architecture, I was already getting up everyone's nose, which seems to be the thing I do. I'm not sure that I quite do it deliberately, but I seem to do it regardless. And I did write a thing about East Circular Quay, which was then just a sort of a gleam in the eye of the developers. And Eugene Cohn was actually in Sydney from New York because he designed a scheme for it, and it was a really horrible building. And I wrote something saying that it's too big, too wide, too ugly, too dreadful, too enclosed, like this big kind of black box shopping center thing. It was a shocker. And I wrote something saying that, and Frank Sartor, who had been an independent alderman, we were all aldermen when we were elected, and had been sacked. They all got sacked, as happens here. And the council was being reconstituted. So there were new elections coming, and he said, why don't you stand on my ticket? And I said, don't be ridiculous. No interest in politics. And I don't like telling lies. And why would I do politics? But then I thought, hang on, wait, this could be fun. And I'd been reading Jonathan Barnett about urban design, and how urban design is really about making the rules, not making the buildings, but making the rules that shape the buildings. And I thought that was an interesting idea. And I thought this might be a chance to play with some of that stuff. So finally I said yes. And that was June or July 91. And then that was quite late, and they printed the ballot papers. You had to put your names down to do it. And the ballot papers were already printed when somebody realized that I wasn't actually a citizen, and you do have to be a citizen to be elected here. So then I had to be kind of fast-tracked through the citizen machine and get kind of done.
The Barnaby Joyce problem.
Yes, exactly. So I'm still dual, but yeah, that might be, yes. So it was a whole interesting process, and I have to say I found politics absolutely fascinating, as well as absolutely infuriating, but really a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, I wondered if you left politics on the high tide of accomplishment or in a fury of frustration.
Well, both, actually. I mean, it was because we, Keating, we had a very pro-development state government, and by luck, we had the numbers in council. So there were 7 councillors, and because Randolph Griffiths, who was actually part of the right wing, the Liberal Party, crossed the floor to vote with us because he thought we had better policies, which was sweet of him. And so we had the numbers on council, but then we had this very oppositional and sort of aggressive state government that kept just wanting to say yes to everything in the long tradition of Sydney. And then Keating was in the federal government, so he was kind of on our side. And so we made alliances with the federal government, which is unusual in city politics. And he became very helpful, even though there's no formal role, of course, for the federal government in local politics. But he was very interested in Circular Quay. And so we had a lot of fun, and we got some things done that we might not otherwise have managed. But I also I think I got myself a reputation for being quite hard line in the principal department. Uncompromising, which I always thought was a good thing, but apparently not if you're Australian.
So having children and writing a doctorate, I tried that one. It's not that easy.
Yeah, no, it's
I was
not.
quite intrigued that your thesis was the Sydney Height of Building story, which exposed the intellectual, cultural and political background of central Sydney development in the early to mid 20th century. At first I thought it might have actually supplied the plot for your foray into youth thrillerdom. Caro was here, but that seems to be an unravelling school truancy. So what attracted you to investigate Sydney's height controls?
Oh, look, that was an accident. I didn't really want to study that at all. I mean, I was engaged, embroiled, I suppose, in local politics by the time that really got going. So I had access to lots of the documents, which was useful. But actually what I wanted to do, and if I had my time again, I would have gone to a completely different faculty and asked them to take me in, because actually I'm going to try and find a way of saying this without being completely libelous, but I found and I still find the intellectual underpinnings of architecture irritatingly precarious. And what I actually wanted to study was something like the relationship between individualism and modernism. That struck me as being really interesting, and I still think that's quite interesting, and I would like to have done that. And the thing I had in mind would have been much more sort of somewhere between social theory and geography and psychology, probably a bit more like Blubberland, as it later turned out. But I couldn't find anybody within the architecture faculty who had a faintest clue what I meant by any of that. And everyone seemed to think it was terribly dull and not the least bit, engaging or interesting or fruitful. And so I got persuaded into doing something much more real and on the ground and kind of practical in a way. And sort of it was really an historical investigation in the end. And it wasn't unuseful, but I was looking for the ideas behind the transformation of Sydney from a 12-story city to a, whatever you like, tower city. And the truth is there weren't any ideas. There's nothing that would pass for an idea. And the most interesting thing about it really was that New York at the same time was undergoing pretty much exactly the same transformation, except that New York already had quite a few skyscrapers by then because it had been competing with Chicago since the 1880s. And New York, in the same arguments and the same kind of beautification commissions and the same public health commissions and investigations and hearings were going on, but they were just so much more erudite and so much more rational in their argument. And even the discussion, there were discussions in Parliament because Sydney ended up imposing a law which was a building height limit. I mean, really. And in the Parliament, it was just, their arguments would not hold water for a moment. I mean, that was just as idiotic then as it is now. And I used to read through all these Hansards and things, and these guys are morons. What? And they may not have been morons. It might just have been that they'd actually made all the decisions in back rooms in private, which is what they still do. And this was just really filibustering. But anyway, whatever the reason was, the whole discussion in New York was immensely more educated and interesting and ideas rich than it was here. So I found it really frustrating and disappointing, actually. But I suppose it's interesting to learn that. But
Oh, well, you spun it into pretty racy text in Blubberland, The Dangers of Happiness in 2007, and Killing Sydney, The Fight for the City's Soul, which you've just published this year. And I really encourage everybody to read it because I find it absolutely fascinating. And I thought it was really interesting that your thesis, your Auckland thesis, returned really in Blubberland, where you looked at the house as a mask and adopted persona. Carapace for the soul, and now flipped into everything, as far as I could follow, that's killing us and the planet. All that McMansion madness and obesogenic suburban ugliness. And unfortunately, I found it interesting, capitalism and democracy, essentially a love song embroiled, and indeed with very well-meaning planners. Anyway, and then Killing Sydney. A utopia disintegrating, really, aesthetically, kinetically, politically, ecologically, genderly and spiritually, and all this orchestrated by modernist architects, property developers, traffic engineers, and unfortunately, again, those pesky planners. I found it very much a kind of a love-hate dichotomy, or full of dichotomies, really. Love-hate with Sydney, city life, architecture, planning. And I was thinking, in your view, what is the perfect city?
Well, I suppose the perfect city is not perfect. That's part of it. And somewhere like, that's why I end up using somewhere like Canberra as a sort of whipping boy, really, which may be a little bit unfair. And I know people in Canberra get slightly offended, not surprisingly. I remember thinking, not when I was in Rome, but I think about Rome, that there's something, and New York is a bit like this too. I think New York is very like Rome, actually, in this regard, that it always feels slightly out of control, that you never have that sense that anybody is actually capable of controlling it. And that's quite comfortable. I find that not completely out of control, but just a little bit on the edge. Like, I remember reading this thing about Rome that's saying that the underground sewer system and so on was so complex that they could never eradicate the rat problem, because they could never actually get to all of the places that they hid. And I thought, maybe that's the mark of it, where it isn't actually, it's big enough and complicated enough and intricate enough that it can't be controlled by the sort of domineering forces of humans. And I think that's really nice. So it makes it feel a little bit like a piece, perhaps, of nature rather than culture, or a kind of mix. So I think, and I do think that sense of, and that's one of the things I love about Sydney, of course, is that sense of intertwined nature and culture, where they're really intricately engaged with each other so that they can't be disentangled, is part of it. And I used in the book, I used a picture of which you can see a lot in Sydney, of one of those sort of fig trees bulging its kind of bark and trunk material, flesh, through this wrought iron fence and kind of, you know, around it, and that, so that neither could be removed without destruction. Yeah, and I think that is part of what I love about Sydney. It's not really about perfect, it's about a city where you can, whereas as a kind of biped, with a desire to engage and with a sort of a mind that likes to pick up ideas and respond to places, that kind of biped, where that kind of person can feel comfortable and at home and endlessly interested. And for me, inner Sydney, even though it is now trying to destroy itself, inner Sydney is still like that. You can still walk those Surrey Hill streets, and even though they're full of, you know, people with $5 million houses now, sort of the barrister classes and upwards, or downwards, perhaps you might say, you can still feel those, its history of opium dens and the rag trade and the razor gangs and the, you know, the slums where Ruth Park, you know, all of those Harp in the South stories, and where the kids just dreamed of nothing but escaping that territory, you know, where it was actually the worst possible place to be. And I find those stories and those laneways and the fact that that fabric is still largely there enchanting. So, and that's, I mean, London does that for me too, I have to say. London also has that sense of storiedness. Yeah. And you wander around the ends of court, and it doesn't matter that it's full of very wealthy, well-connected people, because you can, you know, there are still, the 12th century is still lying there for you to sort of smell and touch and feel. And I love that, love it.
Yeah. Yeah, I noticed that you were also a huge fan of Barcelona and Paris and Istanbul.
Yes.
I did notice, though, that there was no mention of Auckland.
Oh, there was a little bit. I think Auckland figures, but slightly in a bad way, because I think I remember saying something like Sydney did not do what Auckland did in the 80s, which is fillets or kind of drive swathes of motorways and mirror glass through its centre. And I was slightly heartbroken about Auckland. You know, the Auckland that I remembered walking around everywhere as a student had lots of those funny little stone steps and little alleyways and funny little shops and explorable places. And I realize now that I did a lot of that as a student, going and visiting Rodney Kirk-Smith in his little gallery, and just exploring. And it was very explorable. And then came the kind of that's all of those motorways that went, and there was that coarsening of the grain that came with the huge sort of mirror glass push of the 80s. And I was really sad about that with Auckland. It's not why I left, but I was sad about it. And Sydney didn't do that then. It's sort of trying to do it now a bit, but it didn't do it then for all sorts of curious reasons. I once said it jokingly to a journalist, you know, I think it was just too corrupt to get his act together to actually make anything happen. And he wanted proof, but which I don't have. Of course, it probably was, but there were some political reasons. Neville Wran was a premier for a while, and he deliberately frustrated the roads lobby by putting the entertainment centre, for example, right where a motorway was meant to go, and planting other buildings, major institutions, in the middle of road reserves. So it was strategized, which was great, and we should be grateful. We did have some larrikins like that, and Jack Mundy's another one who saved heritage and protected the rocks from being turned into tower and slab buildings, according to Seidler. almost single-handedly by bringing the unions out in force. So there were some heroes of the time as well as corruption.
Yes, and a bit of the Rocks was a bit of a model in the end for the Britomart, and
yes,
a bit of civic activism here, which was,
and the Britomart turned out well.
I have to say, you wouldn't remember me at all, but you were a great after-dinner speaker at a Millennium International Urban Planning History Conference in Sydney. And at the time, you reminded me of a young Germaine Greer. But I'm kind of inclined to think of you now as a kind of a latter-day Antipodean Jane Jacobs. And your work has a lot of parallels, I think, with the death and life of great American cities. And actually, in Killing Sydney, she was one of the few people who didn't earn your scorn.
Right, yeah. She was brilliant, actually, wasn't she? And well ahead of her time.
Yeah, but I'm just wondering, who have been your role models in life?
I'm not, I do have some. I'm not sure that I'm terribly conscious of them. I did actually, I did think, and I do think Germaine was wonderful. I've met her a few times. She's terribly scary. Still, even now, of course, but
I think she's got scarier, actually.
Possibly. She was very funny as a young woman. I mean, I've seen footage which I didn't know about then, and I remember thinking that her feminism was probably a bit extreme for me. Not extreme, but perhaps her expression of it a bit strident, perhaps, which might surprise some people. A lot of people think I'm very strident. But I'm not. My role models are probably writers. In other words, they're writing models more than role models. And what I do, which is I'm quite sure is ridiculous and naive, which is I think, well, you know, this is what I think, and I'm just going to write it down, and then I don't have to push the send button. You know, I can always just not, and then I usually do anyway. And I think, well, there's nothing wrong with telling the truth, and this might be, I think that might be where my naivety comes in. And I have read, who was it? One of the French writers who said, someone like Balzac, who said writing is an exercise in indiscretion, you know, that it's about, and it reminded me of the one of the filmmakers who said writing is like taking your clothes off and running naked in public. And it is, you know, it is that sense of, oh my God, I've really done it this time. Everybody is going to absolutely laugh me off the stage this time. And then just doing it anyway. And I think there's a sense that for me, and this might be to do, I'm not really sure where this comes from, it might be to do with my early love of philosophy, that that the truth is more important than most things, and that especially in public debate as opposed to private, I mean, I'm much more polite in private, but in public conversation, I think it's really important to be able to be rude and critical and truthful, really truthful, because I actually do think that that's how culture improves. And I think we tend to be much too polite in public. We sort of grizzle in private and are polite in public, where I think it should really probably be the other way around. And we should be more robust in our public critique and in our public personas, and not take everything personally, and recognize that there's an important difference between the public realm and conversation and the private ones. And just think, well, okay, fine, he thinks that, I'll say this, you know. So, and not get so emotional about it, because politics has become so emotional, and that's just boring, really.
Well, and we've seen the death of truth over the last few years.
Yes, and I think that's terribly dangerous.
Yeah, I was really quite intrigued too that you tend to have a bit of a love-hate relationship with women in your books as well. After all, they shop and consume. But I also, in Blubberland, you also argue that they're blessed, albeit marginalized, with the capacity for strategic vision, empathy, and a transformative energy you call love. And indeed, in Killing Sydney, they return again to focus on soft and seductive interiors and not the male fixation on hard, shiny, erectile exteriors. Do you think a reconciliation of this binary is relevant or even possible?
Of course, a lot of people take offense at the idea that there's a binary, and I mostly have to preface this conversation with an argument that says I'm not talking about male and female people so much as male and female principles here, which I think is useful, and I think it's a useful distinction to draw, and doesn't necessarily apply or correspond one-on-one with the actual human beings, who are much more complicated. And for example, you can have a female biology and a fairly male kind of mind. But I do think the binary thing is useful. I think that there are differences which help understand what's going on, spatially as much as psychologically. And is it useful? I think reconciliation, I mean, there's a kind of war, of course, between one and the other. But I think that it's true to say, I think it's reasonable at least to argue that the 20th century has been extremely masculinist in ways that are not always obvious, because it's also been a century of feminism. But that despite feminism and despite the whole kind of hippie peace movement, which I think was itself extremely sexist, the sort of status of women has in a lot of ways gone backwards in the last 2 or 3 decades, not least to Trump and all of that. And that's, it's probably more pronounced somewhere like Australia than somewhere like New Zealand, where at least you have to send her. Yes, I'm not sure about reconciliation. I like to think that if we were capable of being slightly more civilized, then we would all recognize that actually fruitful cultures employ both principles in more or less equal degrees and in different ways, in a perhaps often oppositional engagement, but in a way that's reasonably respectful and therefore quite creative, and that probably that's the best way of producing a good, a response to climate change, quite apart from anything else, but also good cities, and also, interesting parallels with how agriculture works too, and the need for what I think of as female thinking there. And it's not exclusive to females, of course, but there's a sort of, when I say strategic, I have been accused occasionally of being misogynist, and possibly I have said things that sound that way, or maybe are. But I think also, I don't think I really am, and I do think it's very important to recognize that what women have to offer as women, what female thinking has to offer perhaps, is more concerned with the future and better at taking a long view for that reason. And that's because we are obviously concerned, and so are men, but perhaps more concerned about and more able to see through the eyes of our children and their children and their children. And that whole thing of, planting a tree now so that in 100 years, great-grandchildren can climb it and can breathe the air, is very important. And I do think that to recognize and deploy that view in what's now bleeping red as our survival is really important, and would be very useful if we could do it more properly.
Yes, particularly with the Code Red news from the UN's Intergovernmental Climate Change Panel. And I've really enjoyed your thinking, I have to say, in terms of climate change, and in terms of sort of thinking about actually in many respects, how to return to what we actually had in terms of compact, walkable city life. And how feasible do you think this is in these pandemic times, where, density is almost a dirty word. We all have to stand 2 Alsatians apart, and we're going through a very, in a sense, anti-city richness phase. The pandemic is.
Yes. And I think there is a danger that the pandemic will send us all back into relentless sprawl, which will really put the seal on irreversible climate change. It's entirely possible. But it seems to me that it's also possible that the sort of opposite of that will emerge from the pandemic, which is that it'll demonstrate to us that one of the things we absolutely love is community. We love being in not just community, but society. I mean, Thatcher said there's no such thing as society, and I think it's proved that she's wrong, that we need collective action. And not only that, but that we love being in busy streets and markets and places with other people and just walking up the road to buy some carrots and, you know, and having a chat with people along the way. That's fun. And not being able to do that shows how valuable it is to have those streets. And I think it's possible that we can learn that lesson. I also think that this is a huge and should be the overwhelming and overriding task of architects and architecture right now is demonstrating that you know what's his name called proximity rather than density, that can be done in a way that's beautiful and enchanting and not horrible. I don't think, you know, that the 1.5 meter separation thing necessitates living in separate suburban houses. I don't think it follows, but if we're not careful, that'll be the knee-jerk response. I think it's up to architects now to imagineer a future that seduces us all into going, you know what, this is an opportunity to do something we haven't done before, and it could be cool. And to some extent, it's reinstating the traditional idea of a town, which was quite well defined and quite dense but small scale in the centre, and then surrounded by quite clear and distinct countryside, but also doing that in a way that's contemporary and you know, connected and interconnected and digitally sort of systematized. So I actually think if you see it that way, it's an opportunity for excitement, and that's how we should take it.
Ebenezer Howard's Garden City with fibre optics.
Yeah.
I know. I've been reading some of your. I've often on read your columns in the Sydney Morning Herald, and I mean, I think it's utterly admirable that you've been able to continue writing for so many years, and the well has never run dry of really good ideas. And you know, just even in your recent columns, they're full of towering phalluses and spitting oysters and an open plan living trap. And I just wonder, thinking about this vast opus of work that you must have now collected, what's been your most controversial opinion piece?
Oh, I'm not sure that I know the answer to that, but one of the ones that's most long-lived in terms of the degree to which people still pillory me about it was one where I said Malcolm Turnbull could be the best Prime Minister and the most enduring Prime Minister of Australia since Menzies. And people still say, oh, you know, because I remember Malcolm from the Spycatcher days, and he was brilliant and funny and interesting, and it seemed to me principled. And there, of course, Malcolm had lots of faults as a Prime Minister, but I still think one of the things that he had in common with Paul Keating was that he was very bright and very articulate and was able to use those facts to change the Australian conversation. I was very disappointed in Malcolm because he didn't seem to have the courage to stand for what I think he believed in, which was essentially climate action. He did earlier on, he crossed the floor on that basis, but when he was Prime Minister, and I'm sure that there were compelling political reasons why he regarded it as impossible, but he didn't do what we all hoped he would do, which was drag the Conservative side of politics towards climate action, which I'm sure he probably still regrets. So, and so people still say, oh, but you said about Malcolm that he was going to be great. And I sort of say, well, it's not my fault that he was a disappointment. He had that potential. I was calling it out. I was actually saying it in the hope that if we recognized it, it would spur him on to to be more that way, which of course it didn't manage to do. But yeah, that was certainly very controversial. Oh, and there was the fight bats thing too, which was funny, which wasn't so much, which was partly based on what I'd written about. It was 10 years ago, and I was actually in Africa at the time, and my phone just started going wild, and I realized it was Twitter, because I had written something about cycling through a cycling piece. I mean, you wouldn't have thought, would you? It was about cycling through Surrey Hills, and about how on the cycle lane up Burke Street, I'd been stopped by three things. One of them was some police on bicycles stopped in the cycle lane having a chat. One was a moving man humping in a mattress to somebody's apartment. And on one was a truck from, and I was silly enough to say, from Maryland's, which I now roughly know where Maryland's is. Then I just said Maryland's, wherever that is. And so that was an excuse for Tim Blair, who was the editor or something of the Daily Telegraph Murdoch paper, to absolutely go off at me. And he called out all his sort of flying monkeys, the trolls, to trash me on Twitter, which was actually quite funny. And then he called a whole lot of us fright bats, and accused us, 10 or 12 women writers, people like Anne Summers and Van Badham, and a whole lot of really very smart women. And he accused us of being terribly emotive and emotional and crying and screaming and, you know, tearing our hair and actually being like witches. And it was part of that whole Tony Abbott ditch the witch push about Julia Gillard, but it was profoundly misogynist. And we thought it was terribly funny, and everyone started making fright bat t-shirts and things. But that was immensely controversial and got me into trouble, of course. So yeah, that was quite fun. But that sort of trouble is quite fun because the women in charge were actually, they were in trouble not because they were emotive, but because they were actually sort of pushing an intellectual agenda, and that was regarded as being immediately, pinko communist, intellectual, feminist, inner city elite. And you get that whole swag of, we just hate you all, which is actually hilarious. I mean, it's not much fun at the time, but it's actually quite funny when you're slightly more distanced from it.
Well, I was going to ask you how you deal with the backlash.
I look the other way. I don't even read it. I mean, I just honestly, this is cowardice. It's partly cowardice and partly that if I do read the comments, I get I do get depressed about it and hurt, but there's another reaction which is worse, more dangerous in a way, which is that because most of the really vituperative backlash stuff is misunderstands or misinterprets what you say, and so there's a tendency to self-censor and not to say things that you think are going to be controversial, or not to say things that are intellectual or that are truthful, and to be more appeasing, more crowd pleasing. And I think that's really dangerous. And I find that if I do that, I sort of start dumbing it down, and and then I just get bored. So in the end, I think I write for me because I write to keep myself interested as much as anything. And
you enjoy speaking truth to power, I think. So
yeah.
bring it on, it's fun.
So I think, well, bugger it, I'm just not going to do that because it's going to destroy the writing, and that's more important. So if I used to get one of my daughters to read them, and she'd say, sometimes she'd say, it's okay, Mummy, you can read them this week. But nowadays, I just honestly mostly don't care. That's really disgraceful. But I'm not, it's not a game of politics. I'm not trying to be popular. I'm just trying to say what I think.
Tell the truth. So apart from cocktails, laughter, and the unknowable future, what are you thinking about doing next?
Well, I am thinking, maybe it's time for something different. I don't honestly know. I mean, I've become involved in this tiny property, what I call a farm, but it's not a farm, in the country. We can't get there at the moment, which is infuriating. And I have a whole lot of things like, for years we had drought and there was no grass, and we had to feed the cattle, of which I have 6, with straw hay. And now there's too much grass and I have to get it cut before the summer. Otherwise it's going to be a serious fire problem, because it's like waist high or more. And fire, climate change. So so I have a few issues, and I'm very interested in regenerative grazing as a way of, you know, not rewilding countryside, but actually there's a way forward for feeding and sustaining humanity without destroying the planet, which seems to me to be really the big issue. So I'm very interested in sustainable food production and whether that's possible, and the way that, if you, and I love biology. One of the things that remains to me from my early medicine days is my absolute love of biology, and so soil microbes are things I get very excited about, and the way they build soil and build soil carbon and have this lovely little symbiotic relationship with the rhizomes that feed the plants, and the way that all works, and the way that is all killed by traditional 20th century traditional farming methods like superphosphate, which has also got New Zealand into trouble by eutrophying all of its lakes and rivers and things, which is terribly destructive of soil and ends up with, you know, soil hardening and compacting and salination, all kinds of terrible things, which is usually blamed on grazing wrongly. So I'm very interested in that whole cycle, and the way that if you understand the microbes, and the microbes are happy, then they'll hold more water, and the land is more hydrated, and then for the rain cycle works better, and those sort of so that's really fun. That's engaged me for a while. Whether that's not sure whether I'm really up to doing a lot of that. I've realized it's quite difficult to do, especially if I haven't got any money. So I might be a bit limited in my capacity to prove some of that, but I'm sort of still playing with some of those ideas down there.
Well, that sounds absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, it's fun. And also writing, of course, writing crime is the other, adult crime is the other thing I'm engaged with.
I was intrigued last week. Mark Wigley joked that he wrote the same book again and again.
Yes.
Returning always to the one enduring problem. So
yeah, it's the same.
Yeah. Well,
and as you say, that thesis, that early masks thesis, reappears. I think for most people that reads as a kind of crazed gobbledygook. For me, it's a sort of a treasure trove of all the things I thought were interesting, and most of them I still think are interesting. Like, for example, the mind-body problem, the relationship between ideas and the real world, which is one of the things that intrigues me about farming, is how you can translate ideas into material.
Practical reality.
Yes.
And something that's useful.
Yeah, and that stuff pops up again and again. So it is interesting to look back on a life and see how those things endure.
Oh, well, I think we should touch base with you on a regular basis to see how things are going. And I really thank you so much for your time, Elizabeth. And it's a huge, do we have time for one question? Time for one question from Lindy Naismith, in fact, asking, do you think architects have much traction at all these days among the myriad of other players involved in making city buildings? Is the profession in its traditional form losing relevance?
Well, that's a very good question, of course, and that's probably a thesis in itself. I'll answer the second bit first. Of course, the traditional form of architecture has largely vanished. Which is something that I regret, and I'm sure most architects regret, because the architecture was largely better. But I do think that it's very hard for architects to have any sway in the development process as it stands. And for most architects, most of their work, I think it's fair to say, is done through developers, and most developers are so not just lowbrow, but monocultural, in the sense that they only care about the bottom line, that it's not true of all, but most, that the result is nearly always disappointing. And I think it's extremely difficult for architects to stand for anything in that context. But I think that the role that I sort of vaguely outlined before, of architects becoming much more loud, much more vocal as part of the public conversation, is really important. Because architects, there's two things about architects which are really valuable, and I think they're under-recognized and underused. And one is to do with beauty, which is, apart from artists who pretend that they're not interested in beauty anymore because it's all about messaging, but architects are the only ones, and even we don't talk about it, but we all know that that's the core of the profession, and that everything else that architects do is done better by some other profession. But the beauty thing, which is to say, doesn't that look astonishing? That thing, which we never say in public, but that's what it's about. That's actually what it's about. We love, that's what we love. That's why we're in it. We want to make things that are beautiful. We want to make the world beautiful. So that's really important. And that's a very important role. And because beauty is a love thing. And that's what we need, people to love their environment. And so that leads on to the second thing, which is what architects do, which is draw, you know, and I know it's all done through computers now, and that's actually really boring. And that's one of the things that's wrong. But architects can make ideas of visions of a future, for want of a better word. They can make them look real. They can make them into a form that people can see. You can do it with words, and I try and do it with words, but a drawing, you know, a drawing is really powerful. And I just think it's really, architects should be involved in the political conversation about development. They should be out there selling that stuff, selling ideas in the marketplace to ordinary humans, and winning hearts and minds, because that's where the battle is being fought now. And it's terribly important. It's just terribly important. And I just wish that every Institute of Architects would be out there pushing that stuff for all they're worth, not getting jobs for the boys. No, that's just stupid. That's so last century. This is really, it's about survival. And I think architects could be really important in that, because if we can persuade people that a more dense future is also more beautiful and more fun, then we'll buy it, you know, and we can do that. And you can do all the recycling and the zero carbon at the same time, and it can be fabulous. And why aren't we doing that? You know, Scandinavia can show that it can happen, but we don't really do that. And I think we should. So,
well,
yes and no.
I think that's the perfect note, and a magnificent answer on which to, and a call to arms, really.
Absolutely.
To finish on. So a huge virtual burst of applause to you.
Thank you, everyone.
Dr.
Lovely
Elizabeth
too.
Farrelly. Thank you so very much.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks.
And just to end, a reminder that the Fast Forward Spring continues next week with Professor Jenny Dixon and myself in conversation with Jude Kulhasi, Senior Urban Development Specialist with the Asian Development Bank. And again, it will be at 6 p.m. So head to our website, fastforward.ac.nz for details and to register for the webinar or use the QR code. Haere rā, good night, and thank you to you all.